The hammer echoed through the valley steady, stubborn, and strong. Clara Boone wiped the sweat from her brow, lifting another log into place. Alone, she was raising a cabin on land no woman dared claim. From the ridge above, James Raleigh watched a widower with a heart as empty as his quiet ranch. Every swing of her hammer stirred something long buried in him. The townsfolk called her foolish, said no woman should live alone out here. But James saw something else, courage, grit, and a kind of loneliness that matched his own. He didn't mean to watch every day, didn't mean to care. But when a storm rolled in that night, and her light went out, he found himself riding straight into the rain. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The storm came screaming down from the high ridge like a herd of ghosts, wind tearing through the pines, rain lashing the valley in sheets, so thick it blurred the horizon into a wall of gray. But James Raleigh didn't slow his horse, he drove it harder, mud splattering up his coat, hat pulled low, his eyes fixed on the faint glimmer of lantern light flickering from the hollow where Clara Boone's half-built cabin stood. He'd told himself he was only checking the fence line, making sure his stock hadn't scattered in the weather. But that was a lie he'd stopped believing by the time the first thunderclap rattled the sky. The townsfolk said the Boone woman was too proud for her own good, building a home alone on land that broke better men. But James had seen something else, not foolishness, but grit. And maybe that same kind of loneliness that had dug its claws into him since the day his wife went into the ground. As he crested the ridge, lightning split the sky, and there she was, a lone figure on the roof, trying to wrestle a tarp over the frame as the wind howled like a living thing. "Damn fool woman," he muttered, spurring his horse forward. The rain hit harder the closer he got, the wind stealing his breath, and when the next gust tore through, he saw her lose her footing, arms flailing before she crashed into the mud below. He was off the horse before it stopped moving, boots sinking deep as he ran to her. She was soaked to the bone, her hair plastered to her face, hands raw from splinters and rope, but she was still clawing at the tarp, stubborn as the storm itself. "Let it go," he barked over the wind, but she only shook her head, coughing. "Roof'll leak if I don't." He didn't argue, just stripped off his duster and threw it around her shoulders, hauling her to her feet. She fought him for a second, wild-eyed, but he caught her arm, steady and sure. "Come on," he said, voice low but firm. "No sense dying for pride." He half-dragged, half-guided her into the cabin, the door slamming behind them as the wind roared outside. The place was barely more than a frame, a few walls, a rough hearth, the smell of sawdust and wet earth, but it was shelter enough. He knelt by the cold fireplace, coaxing a spark from the kindling she'd stacked, and soon the flames caught, casting gold light over the shadows. Clara sat against the wall, trembling, mud streaking her face, but there was still that fire in her eyes, the same one that had made him notice her in the first place. "Didn't ask for saving," she said through chattering teeth, pulling his coat tighter around her shoulders. James looked up from the fire, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Didn't wait for asking," he said simply. For a moment neither spoke. The storm battered the cabin walls, rain drumming against the roof like a heartbeat. But inside, there was a fragile calm, the kind that comes when two stubborn souls find themselves cornered by the same storm. She studied him, the lines on his face, the steadiness in his hands, then looked away, her breath slowing as warmth began to creep back into her. James leaned back against the wall, the firelight flickering over them both, and thought how strange it was that after all the empty years, it took a woman like this, half-wild, half-wounded, to remind him what it felt like to care whether someone survived the night. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the valley washed clean and glistening under a pale sun that fought to burn through the thinning clouds. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, the kind of scent that clung to memory, and James Raleigh found himself standing beside Clara Boone's half-built cabin with a hammer in hand, wondering how he'd gotten roped into another person's fight against the wilderness. She was already on the ladder by the time he came out, sleeves rolled, hair still damp from the night before, her jaw set in that stubborn line he was starting to recognize. "Roof held better than I thought," she said, glancing down at him. "Could have fooled me," he replied, steadying the ladder as she shifted her weight. They worked without much talk, the rhythm of hammer and nail filling the space where words would have gone, a rhythm that felt oddly right, two steady heartbeats against the hush of morning. When she lost her grip on a plank and it nearly slipped, he caught it midair, their fingers brushing for a brief second, and she froze. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Don't mention it," he muttered, looking away. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, though. It was the easy kind, the kind that comes when two people understand the weight the other carries without needing to name it. They worked until the sun crept high, and when the roof was finally patched and the shadows grew shorter, Clara climbed down, dusting her hands against her skirt. "Guess you'll be wanting to head home," she said, trying for nonchalance. But her eyes betrayed a flicker of something else, hesitation, maybe even hope. James shrugged, setting the hammer down. "Ain't in no hurry." She hesitated, then nodded toward the cabin. "Got coffee. Not good coffee, but it's hot." That was enough. Inside, the fire crackled low, the air still damp from the night's rain. She poured them each a tin cup, and they sat across from each other, at the rough table she'd built herself. The quiet stretched between them, not empty but full, the kind of quiet that comes when there's more to say than either knows how. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice soft. "My husband and I were going to come west after the war, build a place, start again. But he didn't make it back from Shiloh." She looked down into her cup, her thumb tracing the rim. "Figured I'd build it anyway. Dream's still a dream, even if it's just one person left to see it through." James nodded slowly, the ache in her words hitting something deep in him. "My wife died birthing our boy," he said after a moment, his tone rough but even. "He didn't last long after. House got awful quiet after that." Clara's gaze lifted to his, and for the first time, neither of them looked away. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of wet cedar through the open door. "You ever get used to it?" she asked. "The quiet?" He thought for a long moment, then shook his head. "No, but it stops hurting after a while. Or maybe you just get too tired to feel it." She smiled faintly, that tired but knowing kind of smile. "Two kinds of loneliness," she said. "Yours and mine." James stared into the fire, then nodded once. "Maybe they don't cancel each other out," he said, "but they make the silence easier to bear." She didn't answer, just sipped her coffee, her eyes softening in the flicker of the flames. And for the first time in years, both of them sat in a silence that didn't ache, a silence that felt like the start of something fragile and true. The valley had barely dried from the last storm before another kind began to brew, not in the sky this time, but in town, where tongues wagged faster than the creek in spring. It started, as such things often did, with a single remark tossed between whiskey glasses at the saloon, a careless joke that found eager ears and quick mouths. By the week's end, everyone in Dry Creek seemed to know that James Raleigh, the quiet widower who hadn't looked twice at a woman since his wife's death, was keeping company with the crazy widow building her own damn house. The men at the bar found it easy sport, laughter spilling like spilled liquor. "Bet she's got him swinging her hammer now," one called, to the roar of others. The kind of laughter that always turned mean before it died. James heard it himself when he rode in for nails and kerosene, their voices loud enough for him to know they wanted him to. He didn't look their way, didn't slow his stride. He just paid for his supplies, nodded to the storekeeper, and left. But later, when he was tightening his saddle, he could still hear the laughter echoing behind him like a splinter that wouldn't work itself out. He'd lived long enough to know that words could wound as deep as bullets if you let them, and he had no intention of letting them near her. Clara Boone, though she didn't have the luxury of ignorance. 2 days later, she rode into town on her mule, straight-backed and sharp-eyed, her skirts dusty, her hair pulled back beneath her hat. She drew stares the way a fire draws moths, part fascination, part scorn. Folks stopped what they were doing as she passed, the seamstress at her doorway, the barber pausing mid-shave, even the preacher's wife pretending not to look while she whispered behind her hand. At the mercantile, she felt their eyes more than she saw them, the murmurs rising just loud enough to sting. "That's her," someone whispered. "The one who bought land like she was a man." Another voice, a woman's, followed. "Heard she lives out there with James Raleigh now. A man's gotta have his reasons." The words hit her like grit to the teeth, sharp and mean. But Clara didn't flinch. She straightened her spine, the sound of her boots on the wooden floor steady as a drumbeat, and set her list on the counter. Flour, salt, nails, and kerosene, she said evenly, her voice carrying just enough to hush the whispers. The storekeeper, a kind man but cautious, nodded and started filling her order, his hands a little too quick, as though afraid of being seen too friendly. When she turned to go, she caught her reflection in the window, mud-spattered, wind-burned, older than she felt, and for a moment, the weight of it all pressed down on her. But then she thought of the cabin rising piece by piece under her hands, of the quiet strength in James's eyes when he swung a hammer beside her, of the way the mountains looked at sunrise, and she felt the shame slide right off her shoulders. She stepped outside into the afternoon sun, letting its warmth cut through the chill of small minds. "Let 'em talk," she murmured, mostly to herself, her jaw set in that same stubborn line that had carried her this far. Back on the ridge, James was mending a fence when he saw her returning, her chin high, her eyes bright with defiance. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't need to. She just tied off her reins, brushed the dust from her skirt, and said, "Seems the town's got its stories." He gave a small nod, wiping sweat from his brow. "Then let him tell him," he said quietly. "We got work worth talking about." And with that, they went back to building, the sound of their hammers ringing louder than any gossip carried on the wind. The day came bright and windless, the kind of afternoon that fooled the valley into thinking summer might last forever. But Clara Boone knew better. The West never let peace sit long. She was hauling water from the creek when she heard the sound of hooves crunching over dry grass, slow and deliberate, the kind of pace that said the rider wasn't passing through but prowling. She straightened, wiping her hands on her skirt, and saw him crest the hill, a broad man with a black hat pulled low, a rifle slung across his back, and a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Clyde Morton, foreman of the Double M Ranch, a man known for breaking horses and people with the same rough hand. He reined in just shy of her fence, his horse snorting as it pawed the dirt. "Afternoon, Mrs. Boone," he called, tipping his hat, though the gesture felt more mock than manner. "Heard talk in town there's a lady setting up house out here. Had to see it myself." Clara didn't move closer. She stood tall, her face unreadable, the sun glinting off the sweat on her brow. "Not much to see yet," she said. "But it's mine." Clyde let out a low chuckle, his gaze sliding slow over the half-built cabin. Then back to her. "Bold thing, a woman taking land in her own name. Brave, too. But bravery don't always keep a person safe. Out here, folks can disappear quicker than a coin in a gambler's hand." His words carried the easy drawl of a man pretending concern, but the shadow in his eyes gave him away. Clara's grip tightened around the bucket handle, though her voice stayed even. "Appreciate the warning. You can tell your boss the land's spoken for." Clyde smiled wider, showing teeth. "Oh, I don't answer to the boss when I'm off the clock, ma'am. Just thought I'd offer a friendly reminder. Women alone don't last long out here." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the sound of wind in the grass. Clara didn't flinch. "Then it's a good thing I'm not like most women." Clyde's grin faltered for half a heartbeat, and then he tipped his hat again. That same mockery in the motion. "Suppose we'll see about that." He turned his horse and rode off slow, like a man who wanted to make sure she watched him go. She did every step until he was nothing but a dust cloud on the horizon. Only then did she let out the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. That evening, when she went to fetch her hammer from the fence post, it was gone. At first she thought she'd misplaced it. She was tired, her mind running ahead of her hands, but then she noticed the hoofprints. Fresh, deep, the same kind of shoes Clyde's horse wore. They circled close to the fence, too close for coincidence. She followed them a few paces before the trail vanished into the grass, her pulse quickening despite herself. The sun dipped low, staining the hills red, and a cold certainty settled in her chest. This wasn't just a man passing through. It was a warning, a message written in mud and malice. Back at the cabin, she set her lantern on the table and stared out through the open door toward the fading horizon. She could tell James, maybe even ask for his help, but she didn't. This was her fight, her land, her name on the deed. She'd come west to prove something not just to the world but to herself, and no man, not even one with a badge or a kind heart, was going to take that from her. Still, As the night settled thick and the coyotes began to call, she found herself checking the rifle by the hearth, running a hand over the stock like a promise. The land outside went dark, but her eyes stayed open, steady and fierce. The morning light spilled gold over the hills, catching the dust that rose from Clara's half-built chimney as she balanced on a stack of stones. Sleeves rolled, jaw set in concentration. Her muscles ached from days of work, but the ache felt good, honest, earned, and she was determined to finish the chimney before the next rain. Below, she heard the familiar sound of hooves and felt her stomach tighten, though she told herself she didn't care. James Raleigh rode up slow, his horse snorting as it caught the scent of smoke and sweat. He dismounted with the quiet ease of a man who'd been raised on horseback, looping the reins over a post before walking toward her. "You're missing a course of mortar there," he said, his voice low but carrying just enough to be heard over the rustle of wind. Clara didn't look down. "I can see that," she replied curtly, scraping at the stone with her trowel. "Then you can see you're about to make a mess of it," he said, smiling faintly. She shot him a glare sharp enough to cut granite. "You here to give advice or lend a hand?" He shrugged, the faintest hint of amusement tugging at his mouth. "Guess I could do both." That earned him a sigh, but she didn't send him away, which in her language was an invitation. He fetched a bucket of water, mixing the mortar as she worked, his movements steady and sure, the rhythm between them easy until it wasn't. When she reached for a heavy log meant for the mantel beam, the thing shifted suddenly, slick with dust, and slipped from her grip. "Clara!" he barked, moving fast, catching the log just before it crashed down onto her shoulder. The weight of it jolted through both of them as he steadied it against the frame, his arm brushing hers. For a moment they froze too close, hearts pounding in the sudden stillness. She stepped back first, cheeks flushed, pride stung harder than her muscles. "I had it," she snapped, though they both knew she didn't. James set the log down carefully, his jaw tightening. "You almost had it, right before it tried to kill you." She crossed her arms, chin high, every inch of her daring him to push further. "I told you I can handle my own work." He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time the patience in his eyes cracked. "This ain't about what you can handle," he said, his voice low and rough. "It's about knowing when not to do it alone." The words hung there, hot as the sun beating on their backs. Clara's breath hitched, her pride warring with the truth she didn't want to admit. The silence stretched until finally she muttered, "You always this bossy when you visit." That broke the tension like a snapped rope. James exhaled, half a chuckle escaping despite himself. "Only when folks try to kill themselves with lumber." She tried to keep her stern look, but failed. A laugh bubbled up, quick and bright, startling even her. "Guess you can stay then," she said, shaking her head, "so long as you keep saving me from myself." He smiled at that, the kind of small, honest smile that had been buried in him for years, and picked up his hammer again. "Reckon I can live with that." The rest of the day passed in companionable silence, their movements falling into a rhythm again, her stubborn drive, his quiet steadiness, two wills circling the same fire. By dusk, the chimney stood tall and true, smoke curling lazily into the cooling air. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, Clara wiped the soot from her brow and looked over at James, his hands black with mortar, eyes catching the last light. "Looks good," she said softly. He nodded once, gaze steady on hers. "So do you." She didn't answer, just turned back to the fire. But he caught the hint of a smile before the shadows claimed her face, and for the first time, their pride didn't feel like a wall but a dance neither wanted to end. The days stretched long and golden as summer settled deep into the valley, the air thick with the scent of pine and sun-warmed grass, and the sound of hammering and saw work gave way to quieter labors, sanding, sealing, shaping the small details that turned a shelter into a home. Clara's cabin rose from the earth like it had always belonged there, every plank and nail bearing the mark of two sets of hands that had learned to move in rhythm, her quick and precise, his steady and unhurried. They worked from dawn until the light faded, eating side by side on the porch when the evenings came cool and the stars began to prick through the darkening sky. It was a strange kind of peace, one neither of them had expected nor dared to want, but it settled over them all the same. Some nights, Clara would talk not much, but enough to fill the air between them with something soft. She told him about the cabin she'd once planned with her husband, about the way he used to laugh when she tried to lift more than she could carry, about how she came west with nothing but a satchel, a hammer, and a promise she didn't know how to keep. James listened quietly, his hands rough and still in his lap, the firelight cutting lines across his face that made him look both older and somehow gentler. When she grew quiet, he found himself talking too about his wife, Mary, about the small grave on his land where the wildflowers grew each spring, about the son who'd never taken a breath. His words came slow, like they'd been waiting years for someone to hear them without pity. Clara didn't offer comfort or say she was sorry, she just listened, and somehow that was more mercy than any prayer. As the weeks went by, their routine became something neither spoke of but both depended on. Mornings meant shared coffee by the fire. Afternoons, the steady clatter of tools. Evenings, quiet conversation that faded into companionable silence. Sometimes, when he returned from his ranch, after tending his herd, he'd find her already waiting, bread baking, a lamp burning, the cabin warm with the kind of light he hadn't known he missed. It was one of those evenings when he found himself watching her longer than he meant to. She was sitting by the hearth, mending a tear in her skirt, the lamplight catching the strands of her hair and the curve of her cheek. She was humming not a tune he knew, just something low and tuneless, a sound more felt than heard, and it caught something in him he thought he'd buried years ago. The rhythm of her needle slowed as she noticed his gaze. For a moment, she didn't say anything, just kept sewing, the corners of her mouth soft but serious. Then, without looking up, she spoke. "Don't look at me like that." Her voice was quiet but firm. James blinked, startled from whatever thought had carried him off. "Like what?" he asked, his tone careful. She looked up then, meeting his eyes, and for the first time he saw not the fierce, unyielding woman who'd built a home with her bare hands, but someone tired and tender and alive in ways that scared them both. "Like you're remembering something you lost," she said. The word struck him harder than he'd have liked to admit. He looked away, down at the rough boards beneath his boots, the silence stretching long and heavy. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney, and he let out a slow breath. "Maybe I am," he said finally, his voice low. "But maybe I'm remembering something I didn't know I was looking for." She didn't answer, only bent her head back over the needlework, her hands trembling just enough for him to notice. Outside, the wind brushed through the trees, and for a long while they sat like that, two people bound by grief and grace, each afraid to name what was quietly taking root between them, each knowing the other could feel it all the same. The night was heavy and moonless, the kind of darkness that swallowed the valley whole. When Clara woke to the sound of hoofbeats, slow at first, then faster, pounding closer through the still air until they broke into shouting, her heart kicked hard in her chest. She sat up, every nerve alive, and reached for the lamp. The flame flared to life, spilling gold across the cabin walls, just as a voice called out from beyond the fence, slick with mockery and drink. "You think a woman can own land out here?" The sound of it froze her blood. Clyde Morton. Even through the dark she could picture his grin, all teeth and cruelty, the kind that came easy to men who'd never been told no. "Come on out, Mrs. Boone," he jeered. "Ain't polite to make guests wait." There were more of them, two at least, their laughter riding on the wind like something rotten. Clara slipped off the bed and pulled her rifle from behind the door, her fingers steady, even though her pulse wasn't. She moved to the window, peering through the curtain, three silhouettes on horseback, lanterns swinging, faces shadowed by their hats. Clyde's voice carried again, louder now. "Heard tell your friend Raleigh's been playing handyman for you. That right? Can't say I blame him. Must get lonely out here all by your lonesome." His words oozed like oil across the night. Clara's jaw tightened. She stepped out onto the porch, the rifle raised, the lamplight spilling around her like a halo cut from fire. "You boys lost?" she called, her voice sharp, clear, unafraid. The laughter died. Clyde nudged his horse closer, his grin spreading wide. "Just paying a call. Make sure you understand the way of things out here. A woman squatting on good land don't sit right with decent folk." "Ain't decent folk the kind that mind their own?" she shot back. His eyes narrowed, the smile fading. "You got a mouth on you, I'll give you that." He leaned in the saddle, spitting into the dirt. But mouths don't mean much when no one's around to hear 'em. She was about to answer when the sharp, familiar click of a rifle bolt cut through the night. "She's not alone," came James Raleigh's voice, low and cold as the steel in his hands. He stepped from the darkness like a shadow come to life, his horse behind him, the barrel of his rifle gleaming faint in the starlight. The men jerked their heads toward him, startled, hands inching toward their holsters, but James didn't flinch. "You boys best ride home while you still can," he said. "Storm's comin'." Clyde barked a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "You got guts, Raleigh. Must be something sweet worth protectin'." His horse shifted nervously under him, sensing the tension. For a long, taut moment, no one moved, the air thick with the promise of violence. James's eyes stayed locked on Clyde's. "Last chance," he said quietly. "Don't make me ruin a good night." The rifle never wavered, and something in that stillness, the kind only a man who'd killed before could hold, made Clyde's grin falter. He spat again, sharp and mean. "We'll be back," he said, tugging his reins. "Ain't no woman and washed-up rancher gonna tell me what's mine." He wheeled his horse around, the others following, their laughter fading into the dark until only the echo of hooves remained. Clara lowered her rifle slowly, her breath coming hard now that the danger had passed. James turned toward her, his face pale in the lamplight, eyes searching hers. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, though her hands trembled. "I would have handled it," she said quietly. He gave a short, knowing nod. "I know," he replied, voice softening. "But I didn't ride all this way to let you prove it." The night wind rustled through the trees again, carrying with it the fading scent of horses and smoke, and for the first time, Clara realized how safe his voice made her feel, and how much that scared her. The first light of dawn bled slow across the valley, a pale gray that carried no warmth, and for a fleeting moment Clara Boone thought the world was quiet again until the acrid scent of smoke hit her nose. She stepped out barefoot, her breath catching in her throat as her eyes took in the ruin. The front of the cabin, her cabin, was blackened with soot, the corner beams charred where someone had poured kerosene and set fire to the wood. It hadn't spread far before dying out. Maybe the wind had shifted. Maybe the rain had saved it, but the damage was done. Her small garden lay crushed beneath boot prints and hoof tracks. The young shoots she'd tended with her own hands trampled to pulp. The sight hollowed her. She dropped to her knees in the damp soil, her fingers trembling as they touched the blackened earth. It wasn't just a garden, it was her first piece of life after loss. Her proof that something could grow again, and now it was nothing but ash. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking as she pressed her palms to the dirt. "No, no, no." The tears came before she could stop them, hot and helpless, dripping onto the ground until they mixed with the mud. Behind her, the soft thud of boots approached. James had ridden in before sunrise, worried after the night before, and the moment he saw the smoke curling faint from the chimney, his chest went tight. He said nothing at first, just looked. The fence slashed, tools scattered, a cruel message carved into one of the beams. Go home. It was the kind of cowardice he knew too well. He crouched beside her slowly, resting a hand on her shoulder, his touch steady but gentle. "They think they can scare you off," he said quietly, voice rough as gravel but steady as the earth beneath them. "Don't give 'em the satisfaction." Clara didn't answer right away. Her jaw was clenched so tight she could feel her pulse pounding in her teeth. The tears stopped as suddenly as they'd come, and when she finally lifted her head, her eyes burned not with grief now, but with fury. "I came here to build something," she said, her voice hoarse but fierce. "Ain't no man alive gonna take that from me." James nodded once, the faintest ghost of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "That's the spirit," he said, standing. "Now, let's see what we can fix before sundown." She rose with him, wiping her face with the back of her sleeve, and for the next hour they walked the property together, taking stock of what had been broken and what could be saved. The garden would take time, the shoots were gone, the soil churned, but the cabin, the heart of her fight, still stood. The burned logs could be replaced, the scars could be sanded down. They started right then, working in a silence that spoke louder than words. James fetched his tools from his horse while Clara hauled buckets of water to wash the soot from the walls. When her arms shook with the weight, he stepped beside her, steadying the bucket without a word, and she didn't push him away. As the sun climbed higher, they worked shoulder to shoulder, the sound of hammer and saw echoing across the valley, not rebuilding what was lost, but reforging it stronger. At noon, sweat streaked their faces, and smoke still hung faint in the air, but the cabin began to look like itself again. James stopped to watch her for a moment, her hair loose and tangled, her hands black with soot, her eyes burning with a quiet fire. "You sure you don't want to move into town till this blows over?" he asked. She paused, turned, and gave him that stubborn half-smile he'd come to know too well. "If I wanted to live where folks told me what I couldn't do, I'd have never left," she said. He chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "Didn't think so." By sundown, the worst of the damage was gone, though their bodies ached and their hands were raw. They sat on the porch steps, side by side, watching the last rays of sunlight burn against the mountains. "They'll come again," she said quietly. "Yeah," he agreed. "And we'll be ready." The wind carried the smell of fresh ash and wildflowers through the valley, and though the scars remained, the land like her refused to bow. The day began quiet, the kind of stillness that settled over the valley after too many storms, when even the birds seemed to hold their breath. Clara had been hanging laundry behind the cabin, the white sheets snapping in the wind, when her dog began to bark low, warning, the kind of sound that made the hairs on her neck rise. She turned slowly, her hands still clutching a damp shirt, and saw him, Clyde Morton, riding up slow as sin, dust curling around his horse's hooves like smoke. He looked meaner than before, hollow-eyed and sweating, his hand never far from the pistol at his hip. The morning light caught the glint of steel as he stopped just beyond the fence, his sneer curling into something ugly. "You should have listened, Mrs. Boone," he called, voice low and hard. "Could have packed up, gone back east. Left this land to folks who know how to keep it." Clara stood her ground, her heart pounding against her ribs, but her face showed nothing. "You've done enough damage, Clyde," she said evenly. "Get off my land." He laughed, bitter and broken. "Your land? You think a woman can own dirt? You think because some lawyer wrote your name on a piece of paper, that makes it true? Out here, truth comes from the man still standing at the end of the fight." His hand twitched toward his holster, and in that split second, Clara knew what was coming, but before she could move, another voice cut through the air like a whip. "Then I reckon you just told me who's gonna fall." James Raleigh stepped from behind the barn, rifle in hand, his face carved in stone. He'd been nearby all morning, checking his herd in the lower pasture, and when he saw Clyde's horse at the ridge, something in his gut had told him this was the reckoning they'd been waiting for. "You again," Clyde spat, hatred twisting his mouth, always playing the hero. His gun flashed, the crack split the silence, and Clara screamed as James staggered, the bullet tearing a line across his shoulder. He dropped to one knee, gritting his teeth, blood darkening his shirt. "James!" she cried, rushing forward, but he barked out, "Stay back." Clyde cocked the hammer again, his grin returning. "Told you, woman, you don't belong here." But before he could fire, Clara moved. Fast, fierce. She grabbed the rifle leaning against the cabin wall, the one James had taught her to shoot with, and raised it in one smooth motion. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, but she didn't flinch. The shot hit Clyde square in the leg, knocking him off his horse with a roar of pain. He hit the dirt hard, cursing, clutching his thigh as the blood spread through his trousers. You goddamn," he started, but the words broke off into a scream as she stepped forward, rifle leveled, her face pale but unshaken. "You come back again," she said, her voice steady as a church bell, "and I'll aim higher." The echo of her words lingered long after the gunshot faded. A warning carried on the wind. Within the hour, the sheriff arrived. Word had spread fast from a ranch hand who'd heard the commotion. Sheriff Harlan dismounted slow, taking in the scene. Clyde writhing in the dirt. James bleeding but upright. Clara standing guard like she'd been born to it. He let out a low whistle. "Hell of a morning," he said. "He drew first?" Clara nodded once, her hands trembling now that the danger had passed. The sheriff looked at her for a long moment, then down at Clyde. "You're damn lucky she's got a steadier hand than most men I know," he muttered, hauling Clyde to his feet. Far as I'm concerned, she's the toughest woman in the territory. Clyde spat blood and hate into the dirt, but he didn't speak. The sheriff bound him, threw him over his horse, and rode off toward town, leaving silence in his wake. Clara turned to James, who was sitting on the porch steps, holding a rag to his shoulder, his jaw tight. She knelt beside him, her fingers brushing his arm. "You shouldn't have stepped in front of me," she whispered. He winced, but there was a faint smile behind the pain. "Wasn't thinking," he said softly. "Just doing what felt right." She met his eyes, that steady, quiet gaze that had seen her through every trial since the day he rode into her storm, and for the first time, she didn't look away. "Guess we both did what felt right," she said, voice trembling but proud. Behind them, the cabin stood strong, smoke curling from the chimney, a home that had been fought for, bled for, and finally, truly earned. The weeks that followed passed in a hush, like the land itself had drawn a deep breath and finally let it go. The scars on James's shoulder had begun to heal, pink and jagged but strong, and the marks of fire and violence around the cabin faded beneath the slow rhythm of rebuilding, not out of necessity this time, but out of care. Clara sanded the rough edges of the walls until they were smooth beneath her fingertips, mended her garden row by row, and watched the first green shoots push through the soil again, stubborn and alive. James came by each morning, claiming to check the fence line, though both of them knew he was doing no such thing. He'd always show up with something in his hands, a coil of rope, a sack of nails, a basket of eggs from his hens, and she'd always pretend not to notice the excuses. When the last board was nailed and the last smoke-stained beam replaced, the cabin stood proud and complete, a house made not just from timber and sweat, but from something rarer, something earned through fight and flame. The night they finished, the air was soft with the scent of wild sage and wood smoke. Clara lit the lanterns, their glow spilling warmth across the cabin's new walls, and set the small table she'd built herself, 2 plates, 2 cups, stew simmering on the stove. She smoothed the cloth with calloused hands that trembled just a little. Outside, she heard the familiar sound of boots on the porch, and when the door swung open, James stood there, his broad frame filling the doorway, one arm behind his back. He looked cleaner than she'd seen him in months, freshly shaven, hair combed, shirt tucked in despite the faint awkwardness that came with it. "Brought something," he said, stepping inside and revealing a small bundle of wildflowers, purple lupine, sun-yellow arnica, and 1 stem of blue flax. "Ain't much," he added quickly, as if embarrassed. Clara took them gently, her eyes softening as she inhaled their faint scent. "They're perfect," she said simply, setting them in a chipped jar on the table. He hesitated, watching her move, the way her hair caught the lamplight, the way she filled the space with quiet grace. Then he cleared his throat. "Been thinking," he began, pulling out a chair but not sitting just yet. "About my place over the ridge. Don't see much sense in keeping it. Too big for one man and too empty besides." She glanced up, a hint of curiosity tugging her mouth. "You planning on selling it?" "Already did," he said, meeting her gaze. "Got a fair price for the stock and the land. Figured." He paused, the words sticking in his throat until he forced them out. "Figured this place could use a man around." For a moment, neither spoke. The fire popped, the smell of stew filled the air, and outside the coyotes sang somewhere far off in the dark. Then Clara's lips curved into that small, knowing smile that had undone him more times than he'd admit. "Maybe," she said, eyes glinting with mischief, "but only if you don't mind taking orders." James laughed, a real laugh this time, deep and warm, shaking his head. "Reckon I've been taking 'em from you since the day we met," he said, finally sitting down across from her. They ate together as the night settled around them, talking little, their silence threaded with ease and familiarity. Afterward, he leaned back, watching her gather the dishes, and said softly, "You know, for the first time in a long while, this valley feels like home." She turned toward him, that smile returning, tender and sure. "It is home," she said, "for both of us." Outside, the wind whispered through the grass, gentle now, no longer howling or cruel. The chimney smoke curled into the twilight sky, steady and peaceful, marking the place where two broken hearts had mended themselves into something whole. And as the stars rose above the ridge, Clara and James sat together at their table not as a widow and a rancher, not as survivors of what the world had taken, but simply as two souls who had found, at last, a place to rest.